Have you ever wondered what Jesus specifically said about the topic of war? Well, I thought I'd address that, especially since it's interesting that leading up to Easter is the time in which Jesus specifically spoke about war. And I find it interesting because we are currently in our Easter Passion Week. Jesus has entered Jerusalem to the shouts of Hosanna and people ready for Jesus to become the warrior king that many are hoping that he would become. And Jesus sits down with the disciples at some point just outside of Jerusalem and has what is known as what scholars call the Olivet Discourse. And in it, Jesus said, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. In various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the signs of the birth pangs." I find that very interesting that, especially the timing of this all, this Easter week, that we are in the midst of talking about war with Syria. Donald Trump is starting to beat the war drum. He recently fired off some shots at Syria in retaliation for their alleged gassing of women and children and other innocent civilian non-combatants in Syria. And now there is talk by Nikki Haley and others at the United Nations of regime change, George W. Bush style, in Syria and fighting a war against ISIS and all these sort of things. Well, I find it very interesting this timing because it's about this timing in which Jesus delivered this discourse to the disciples outside of Jerusalem. Jesus talked about wars and rumors of wars, and these being signs of the birth pangs of his return. And he talked about wars and rumors and wars in the context of famines, nations rising against nations, and earthquakes. All things which I would classify as not good. So if you're thinking Jesus has a good view on war, a just view on war, I would challenge you with this passion narrative that Jesus spoke of, in which he equated war with earthquakes, famines, plagues, and basically the end of the world. It's interesting that the further you go in the discourse, and if you read this all in context, depending on your particularly scholarly slant and theological view on this, you might have a slightly different perspective. But Jesus is ultimately talking about here also the fall of Jerusalem, either back in his day and or the future. He talked about the disciples instead of, rising up to defend Jerusalem against its Roman invaders or Babylonian invaders or whoever you want to identify Jesus as speaking of here, as of one day invading Jerusalem and not leaving stone upon stone in Jerusalem, and that one day the temple would be torn down. Instead of calling Jesus to prepare his disciples to be ready to defend Jerusalem against the ensuing invasion that was getting ready to come, Jesus told them that these are the warning signs of his coming, and he instructed them to flee to the mountains, and he called down woe upon those who are nursing in those days, or should they have to flee on a Sabbath. If you want to know what Jesus talked about in regards to war, well, he addresses it in this chapter in Matthew 24. I'd highly encourage you to read it. You can also read other accounts of it in the other parts of the Gospels. But I find it highly prophetic that Jesus Christ, and the week before he was crucified, in which everybody was expecting him to rise up and be another Judas Maccabees who would lead the Jews into revolt against Rome, actually spoke about war in the context of the end of the world, the end of Jerusalem, and ultimately as a terrible, terrible sign. So instead of being happy about whatever we're getting ready to do, instead of being pro-war and beating the war drums with Donald Trump and the rest of the nations, instead of pursuing what we would invent just war, Jesus didn't speak of just war. He spoke of wars which would ultimately be the signs of the end of all things. So if you want to say Jesus is a proponent of war, I challenge you to do that in light of this context of the Olivet Discourse. Hey, this is Jimmy, everybody. Have a good day. Have a good Easter.